Sarah Blake never thought she'd be back in a small town. After years of service in the military, moving from base to base, she was used to constant change, to not putting down roots. But now, with retirement behind her and no clear direction for her future, she found herself in a quiet, dusty corner of the world, far away from the bustle of city life, with only the wind, her thoughts, and the ranch to keep her company. The isolation was both a comfort and a cage. It was in this solitude that she'd come to volunteer at the local animal shelter, helping with dogs, cats, and occasionally, horses. The animals, like her, seemed to carry their own burdens, each one broken in some way. And yet, all of them still had hope. That hope was something Sarah longed to find within herself. The memories of her time in the military still haunted her, late-night nightmares, echoes of battles fought, friends lost, the invisible scars too deep for most to understand. But there, amidst the quiet animals of the shelter, she found something she hadn't expected. Peace. It was the stillness of their eyes, the simplicity of their needs, that soothed the storm inside her. One day, a special event was being held by the rescue organization, a fundraiser to help place horses in new homes. Sarah hadn't intended to attend, but something nudged her, some silent force urging her to go. She stood among the crowd, watching the parade of horses that trotted by, all healthy, strong, and spirited. But then she saw him. Dusty was different. He was a weathered Mustang, his coat a dull shade of gray, and his body, though still large, seemed to sag under the weight of time. His eyes, however, told a story. They were deep and sad, like they had seen too much, too many storms, too much hardship. He stood at the back of the pen, away from the other horses, his head low. There was something about him that struck Sarah to her core. The crowd seemed indifferent, moving on to look at younger, livelier animals, but Sarah couldn't tear her eyes away from Dusty. A worker approached, offering a few details. "He's been with us for a while," she said, almost apologetically. "He's not as strong as the others, and his health is, well, it's failing. The rescue's thinking of putting him down soon if we don't find someone to take him." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She felt a familiar pang, one she had not expected from an animal, but something that resonated deep inside her. She recognized it. Dusty, like her, had been left behind. He didn't deserve to be forgotten. Without thinking, she spoke, the words coming out before she could stop them. "I'll take him." The worker's eyes widened in surprise, but Sarah didn't back down. Her heart was racing, but the decision felt right. There was something in Dusty's eyes that mirrored her own struggle. Both of them had faced things that others could never understand. And yet, in that moment, she realized that maybe they could heal together. The drive back to Sarah's ranch was quiet, the only sounds being the occasional snort from Dusty in the trailer behind her and the hum of the tires on the road. Sarah's heart beat a little faster as she thought about what she had just committed to. She hadn't thought it through. She had acted on instinct, a sudden rush of compassion. But now, as she turned down the dirt road leading to her ranch, doubt crept in. What had she gotten herself into? She had no experience with horses, and Dusty was far from healthy. His ribs were visible beneath his coat, and his eyes were clouded with exhaustion. She knew little about what he needed or how to care for him. But Sarah had never been one to back down from a challenge. She had faced impossible odds during her time in the service, and now she felt as though her purpose lay in helping this horse, who had lived a life of abandonment just like her. When she opened the trailer door and led Dusty out, he hesitated, his legs unsteady on the soft grass. He swayed a little before steadying himself, his muscles stiff from lack of use. Sarah gently placed a hand on his shoulder, feeling the warmth of his skin through the thick fur. "Welcome home," she whispered. The first few days were harder than she had expected. Dusty was wary of everything. The unfamiliar surroundings, Sarah's presence, even the food she offered. He would nudge it away, staring at her with eyes that seemed to say, "I don't trust you." Sarah, on the other hand, felt a strange mixture of fear and hope. She was unsure of how to approach him. Every time she tried to get closer, Dusty would pull back, his body language tense. His injuries, though not immediately visible, were affecting him more than she had realized. He had a slight limp, and his shoulders were stiff from what appeared to be old scars, possibly from being mishandled in the past. It reminded Sarah of her own aches, physical, emotional scars that time had not healed. It felt like Dusty was a reflection of everything she had left behind in her military life, broken yet still here. Each day, Sarah worked with Dusty patiently, offering him food, water, and companionship, but progress was slow. He would still shy away from her touch, flicking his ears nervously whenever she moved too quickly. Sarah knew she had to earn his trust, just as she had to rebuild her own life piece by piece. By the end of the week, she started seeing small improvements. Dusty's coat was beginning to shine a little more. His step was a bit stronger, and sometimes he would nuzzle her hand, not out of trust, but out of curiosity. For the first time in a long time, Sarah felt a small glimmer of something like hope. It was fragile, but it was there. Days turned into weeks, and Sarah's bond with Dusty deepened, while the Mustang's physical health was slowly improving. His emotional scars were much harder to heal. He was still wary of human touch, flinching at sudden movements and retreating to the furthest corner of the pasture whenever Sarah approached too quickly. But Sarah understood that trust wasn't something that could be rushed. It had to be earned, and she wasn't giving up on him. One morning, as Sarah was grooming Dusty, she noticed something that hadn't caught her attention before. At the base of his neck, just beneath his mane, there was a faded brand, a peculiar symbol that looked like a crude marking, one that had been roughly burned into his skin. The brand was old, the edges blurred by time and the healing of his coat, but it was unmistakable. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She had heard of horses being branded in the past, but it was rare for rescue horses to still carry such visible marks. This was no ordinary branding. It looked like something used by the government. Her curiosity got the better of her, and she started researching online, typing in the brand's design into various search engines. It took hours of sifting through articles and old news clippings, but eventually she found something. A local historian specializing in wild Mustangs mentioned in a piece that the U.S. government had once run a controversial program in which wild horses were captured, branded, and trained for military purposes. They were used in training exercises, as pack animals, and in some cases, even for cavalry training. As Sarah read through the details, she felt her heart sink. Dusty had been part of that program. The thought of a wild Mustang being captured, branded, and then subjected to harsh training made her stomach turn. But it was clear now. Dusty wasn't just abandoned by his previous owner. He had been taken from his home, from his freedom. And the brand on his neck wasn't just a symbol. It was a mark of ownership, of control, and of a system that didn't care about the creatures it used. That night, as Sarah sat on her porch, a storm brewing in the distance, she couldn't stop thinking about Dusty's past. She wondered about his herd. Had they been captured too? Had they seen the same horrors? She thought about how the Mustang had once roamed free, his hooves pounding across open plains, before his life had been stolen from him. The thought echoed her own experience, how her freedom had been ripped away when she enlisted, how she had been shaped into something the military needed, not someone who could live a life on her own terms. The more she thought about it, the more she realized how deeply connected she and Dusty were. They were both survivors, both forced to endure situations beyond their control. And like Dusty, Sarah wasn't sure she would ever be able to fully forget the things that had been done to her. As the weeks passed, Sarah noticed a change in herself that she hadn't anticipated. Caring for Dusty had become more than just a daily responsibility. It was a form of therapy. She would wake up early each morning, step out into the cool air of the ranch, and find comfort in Dusty's steady presence. Despite his wariness, there was something calming about his quiet strength. It was almost as if the bond between them was growing without either of them realizing it. Dusty, though still reserved, began to show small signs of improvement. He stood a little taller now, his coat starting to regain some of its luster. His limp, though still there, was less pronounced, and his once sunken eyes were now more alert, though tinged with the remnants of a painful past. But it wasn't just his body that was healing. It was his spirit, too. Sarah could see it in the way he would occasionally nudge her hand when she offered him food or gently rest his head on her shoulder when she was near. It was subtle, but it was progress. For Sarah, the process of healing was slower. There were days when she woke up and felt overwhelmed by the weight of her memories, flashbacks of battles fought, the camaraderie with her fellow soldiers, and the crushing loss of friends in the line of duty. The nightmares were often too vivid to ignore, and she found herself reliving those moments of terror as though they were happening all over again. It was easy to retreat into the quiet of the ranch, to avoid facing the people who might ask questions she didn't want to answer. But with Dusty there was no judgment, no expectations, just quiet companionship. Every evening, she would sit beside him in the barn, the two of them watching the sun set over the horizon. The air was thick with the scent of hay and the distant sound of birds. And for a while, she felt at peace. It wasn't a complete peace. She still carried the weight of her past, but it was a peace she hadn't felt in years. One particularly rough night, after yet another nightmare left her shaken, Sarah found herself wandering into the barn, drawn to Dusty's presence. She didn't speak, just sat quietly beside him, her fingers brushing against his mane. And to her surprise, Dusty leaned into her, his head resting on her lap. It was as though, in that moment, the Mustang understood her pain as much as she understood his. She closed her eyes, letting the weight of the moment wash over her. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel so alone. The two of them, broken but still standing, had found something in each other that neither had expected. And as Sarah sat there, her hand gently stroking Dusty's mane, she realized that maybe, just maybe, they could heal together. It was a quiet afternoon when Sarah first noticed her visitor. A dust trail in the distance signaled the arrival of a car, its tires crunching over the gravel driveway. Sarah looked up from the fence where she had been fixing the wire, wiping her brow with the back of her hand. She hadn't been expecting anyone, and the sudden interruption felt jarring. The car slowed and came to a stop in front of the barn, where Dusty stood grazing, his head lowered in the warm sun. A woman stepped out, her movements confident but careful, as though she was familiar with the land, but not entirely sure of her reception. She was middle-aged, with a weathered face that spoke of someone who had spent much of her life outdoors, her dark hair pulled back into a simple braid. "Hello," the woman called out, her voice soft but steady. Sarah straightened, dusting her hands off. "Can I help you?" The woman smiled faintly, her eyes softening when they landed on Dusty. "I didn't expect you to still be here," she said, her gaze lingering on the aging Mustang. "I heard you adopted him." The words caught Sarah off guard. "You know him?" she asked, her heart beating a little faster. Something about the woman's voice made her uneasy, like she was a part of Dusty's past that Sarah hadn't yet uncovered. The woman nodded, stepping closer. "I used to know him. My family raised him before he was taken by the government program. He was part of our herd, back before everything changed." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. The pieces of Dusty's past that she had uncovered so far were painful enough, but hearing someone else speak of it made it more real, more personal. She gestured toward Dusty, who was now eyeing the woman cautiously, but made no move to retreat. "My name's Marie," the woman continued, her voice tinged with sadness. "I haven't seen him in years, not since the wildfire took most of our herd. I didn't know he had ended up here. But I'm glad you found him." A cold shiver ran down Sarah's spine as Marie spoke. She had heard about the wildfire that had devastated the Mustang population years ago, but to hear that Dusty had survived it, only to be taken and branded by the military, was almost too much to comprehend. The history she had only begun to piece together suddenly felt more real. Dusty hadn't just been abandoned. He had been part of something far larger, something that had stripped him of his freedom, his family, and his identity. "I'm sorry," Marie said quietly, breaking Sarah from her thoughts. "I didn't mean to upset you. It's hard to see him like this. He was always such a proud, wild stallion." The words stung. Dusty had been more than a victim of circumstance. He had been a symbol of freedom. And now, all that was left of him was the faint outline of a past that had been stolen. Sarah looked at him, standing a little crooked now, his once proud stance diminished by age and wear, and felt a deep, aching sympathy. She wasn't just caring for a horse. She was caring for a soul who had been broken by forces beyond his control. Marie's eyes softened, and she took a deep breath. "If you ever want to know more about him, about his life before everything changed, I'm here." As Sarah stood there, the weight of Dusty's history settling around her, she realized that there was so much more to this story than she had imagined. Dusty's past wasn't just tragic. It was filled with lost opportunities, stolen freedom, and a life that had been torn apart. And now, it seemed that Sarah was the one who was meant to piece it all back together. The conversation with Marie left Sarah in a state of quiet reflection. She had learned more about Dusty's past in that brief exchange than she had in all her time caring for him. The Mustang hadn't just been a victim of abandonment. He had been stolen from his home, his family, and his freedom. Sarah understood that kind of loss all too well. Her own service in the military had been about sacrifice, sacrificing her own desires, her own identity, and in many ways, her own peace of mind for the greater good. But the price had been steep. As the days passed, Sarah found herself spending more time with Dusty. They were beginning to settle into a rhythm. She would groom him, walk him around the pasture, and spend quiet evenings just sitting with him. There were moments when she felt as though they were both speaking to each other without words, understanding each other's pain, even if it was only in fleeting, silent ways. But every time she thought she was healing, the memories would come crashing back. That night, she woke in the dark, her chest tight and heart racing. Another nightmare. She had seen it all too clearly. The explosion, the gunfire, the desperate cry of a friend she couldn't save. It had been a mission, a routine one, and yet it had turned into a nightmare that still haunted her, even after all this time. She sat up in bed, her breath shallow, and tried to steady herself. The darkness of the room felt suffocating. In the corner of the room, she noticed Dusty's silhouette through the open window, standing in the barn. She didn't hesitate. Pulling on her boots, she stepped out into the cold night air, the sharp wind biting her skin. The moon cast a pale glow over the pasture, and there, by the barn, stood Dusty. His body was still, as though waiting for something, for someone. Sarah walked toward him slowly, her heart still pounding in her chest. She reached out, and without hesitation, Dusty nuzzled her hand. His breath was warm against her skin, and for a moment, it felt like the world was standing still. She closed her eyes, letting the sound of his soft breathing calm her. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. That was when it hit her. The memories would never fully go away. The guilt, the sorrow, the pain, they would always be there, lurking in the background. But she didn't have to let them control her. Dusty, in his quiet, steady way, was teaching her that healing wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning to live with it, to move forward despite it. She had thought she was saving him. But in many ways, it was Dusty who had been saving her all along. In that moment, Sarah knew something had shifted. She wasn't just a veteran looking for redemption. She was a person who had a future where healing was possible. Not just for Dusty, but for herself too. As the weeks turned into months, the bond between Sarah and Dusty continued to grow stronger. Sarah had started to see the subtle changes in herself that she hadn't expected. The nightmares became less frequent, and when they did come, she found that she could shake them off more easily, grounding herself in the present. Dusty's steady presence had a calming effect on her, and she began to realize that her healing wasn't just happening in isolation. It was happening alongside him, in tandem with his progress. Dusty, too, was improving. His coat had become thick and shiny, his ribs no longer visible beneath his fur, and his limp had all but disappeared. But it wasn't just his physical appearance that had changed. There was a new light in his eyes, a spark that hadn't been there when she first brought him home. He was still wary at times, but the hesitancy in his movements had softened. He would approach her now, not with the fear of someone who had been broken, but with the tentative trust of an animal who was beginning to understand that not all humans were out to hurt him. One afternoon, as Sarah was brushing Dusty in the barn, she heard the sound of a car pulling up. She didn't need to look to know who it was. Marie had returned, as she had promised. But this time, there was a different energy between them. There was no longer the heaviness of the past in the air. Instead, it felt like a moment of reconciliation, as though the history between them, the one tied to Dusty, had finally come full circle. Marie stepped out of her truck, her eyes immediately searching for Dusty. When she saw him, she stopped in her tracks, a soft gasp escaping her lips. Dusty was standing near the pasture gate, his mane flowing in the breeze, looking much healthier than the gaunt animal Marie had last seen. "Well, I'll be damned," Marie whispered, walking slowly toward him. She stopped a few feet away, letting Dusty come to her. The Mustang hesitated for a moment before he took a few careful steps forward, his nose reaching out to nuzzle Marie's outstretched hand. "I never thought I'd see him like this again," Marie said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've done something incredible here, Sarah." Sarah watched the scene unfold before her. Marie was crying quietly, her hands gently brushing through Dusty's coat as if she was making up for lost time. It was a tender moment, one that spoke volumes about the power of second chances, both for Dusty and for Marie. Sarah knew that Dusty had been part of a larger story, one that had been filled with pain and separation, but this moment was proof that healing was possible, even in the most broken of circumstances. "I didn't do it alone," Sarah replied softly. "We both saved each other." Marie smiled through her tears, finally lifting her gaze to Sarah. "I think you're right about that. He's lucky to have you." The words felt like a weight lifting off Sarah's shoulders, as if the burden she had been carrying for so long had finally been shared. It wasn't just about saving Dusty. It was about finding a purpose, a reason to move forward. And for Sarah, that reason had become clear. She wasn't just a survivor of her past. She was someone who could create a future filled with healing, hope, and the promise of new beginnings. As the seasons changed, so did Sarah's life. The harsh, unforgiving winter gave way to the gentle warmth of spring, and with it came a sense of renewal. Dusty's coat had grown thick and glossy, and his once wary steps had transformed into confident strides. He was no longer the frightened Mustang who had first arrived on her ranch, his spirit broken by a lifetime of hardships. He had become the embodiment of resilience, a testament to the power of patience and care. Sarah, too, had begun to heal in ways she hadn't anticipated. The nightmares had become rare, and when they did visit her in the quiet of the night, she now knew how to handle them. The overwhelming sense of guilt that had once ruled her thoughts had softened, replaced by an understanding that healing wasn't linear. It came in waves. Some days would be harder than others, but she could now navigate through those moments, always returning to the steady presence of Dusty, who had, in his own way, taught her the art of moving forward. One morning, as Sarah sat on the porch, sipping her coffee and watching the sunrise, she realized how far she had come. Dusty was grazing peacefully in the field, his muscles rippling beneath the sunlight, and for the first time in a long while, Sarah didn't feel like she was carrying the weight of her past. The ranch, once a quiet escape, now felt like home, a place of healing, not just for Dusty, but for herself. Marie visited often, and the two women had formed a deep, unspoken bond. While Dusty had brought them together, it was their shared experiences of loss, survival, and the unspoken understanding of what it meant to live through trauma that had forged a lasting friendship. Marie had even brought Dusty's old herd records, which had been tucked away in a dusty box, forgotten by time. It turned out that Dusty was not just any Mustang. He had been a part of a rare and prized herd, one that had been known for its beauty and strength. His lineage was something to be proud of, something to celebrate. But for Sarah, what mattered more was the life Dusty had now, the life she was helping him build. The Mustang, once a broken creature, had found solace in the quiet companionship of his new home. And in return, Sarah had found purpose, a purpose she had lost somewhere between the battlefield and the quiet solitude of her ranch. As she watched Dusty trot across the field, his head held high, Sarah knew that their journey together wasn't over. There would always be challenges ahead, but together they had learned the power of healing, and perhaps, just perhaps, they could both move forward, step by step, hoof by hoof, into a future that was no longer defined by the past, but by the possibility of new beginnings.